I've been a patient man my entire life. My father raised me to believe that patience wasn't weakness, it was the quiet strength of a man who knew his own worth. I carried that lesson through 22 years of marriage, through deployments and promotions, through the sleepless nights of early parenthood and the slow, comfortable settling of middle age. I carried it right up until the afternoon I got a call from Jefferson Elementary telling me my 8-year-old son, Tyler, had been sitting alone in the school office for 3 hours. My name is Ronald Garrett. I'm a 51-year-old civil engineer with a firm I built from the ground up. My wife, my soon-to-be former wife, is Melissa Garrett, Colonel Melissa Garrett of the United States Army, decorated, celebrated, admired by everyone who had ever served under her command. She was brilliant. She was disciplined. She was, I had believed for over 2 decades, loyal. The school secretary's voice was carefully neutral when she called me that Tuesday afternoon. Mr. Garrett, Tyler has been here since dismissal at 3 o'clock. It's now 6:15. We've been trying to reach Mrs. Garrett repeatedly. Is everything all right at home? I remember the exact moment the words registered. I was at my desk reviewing load calculations for a bridge project in Portland. The pen in my hand stopped moving. 6:15. Tyler had been sitting in that office for over 3 hours, alone, probably hungry, almost certainly frightened, waiting for his mother who never came. I'm on my way, I said. Don't let him leave with anyone. I was in my car before the secretary could respond. The drive to Jefferson Elementary took 11 minutes. Every one of those minutes felt like a small, controlled burn somewhere in my chest. I kept my hand steady on the wheel. I kept my breathing even. I called Melissa's cell phone twice. It went to voicemail both times. I called her work line at the base. The duty officer told me she had signed out at 1,400 hours, 2 o'clock, and had not returned. I called her personal cell again. Voicemail. Tyler was sitting in a plastic chair outside the principal's office when I walked through the door. He had his backpack on his lap, both arms wrapped around it like it was a life preserver. His hair was messy and his eyes were red-rimmed, but he straightened when he saw me, the way boys do when they're trying to look like they haven't been crying. That straightening broke something in me far more efficiently than tears would have. Hey, buddy, I said, crouching in front of him. Sorry I wasn't here sooner. You okay? Mom didn't come, he said simply. I know. She must have gotten confused about the schedule. It won't happen again. I said it calmly. I believed half of it. I was certain it would not happen again because I was already, in those 11 minutes of driving, beginning to understand that things were about to change permanently. I signed him out, thanked the secretary, apologized to the principal, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Chambers who gave me a look that said she had seen this kind of thing before and found it no less sad for the repetition, and took Tyler to get a burger and fries because he hadn't eaten since lunch. He talked about a project he was doing in science class about volcanoes. He wanted to build a model that actually erupted. I told him we'd do it that weekend. He seemed satisfied with that, and by the time we got home, the red rims around his eyes had faded. I got him through homework and bath and bedtime without letting him see a single degree of what was happening inside me. Then I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold and I waited. Melissa came home at 10:47. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the microwave the moment I heard her key in the lock. She walked into the kitchen still in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a light blue blouse I recognized, her hair down. She looked surprised to see me sitting there. Not guilty. Surprised. That detail lodged itself somewhere specific in my mind and stayed there. You're up late, she said, moving to the refrigerator. Tyler was at school until after 6, I said. She went still with her hand on the refrigerator door. He was sitting in the principal's office, I continued. Alone. For 3 hours and 15 minutes. They couldn't reach you. She turned around slowly. Ronald, I can explain, I'd like you to, I said. I genuinely would. She sat down across from me. And she explained. The explanation was, in its way, more damaging than anything I had imagined during those 11 minutes in the car. She hadn't forgotten Tyler. She had made a conscious choice. An old friend, she said, had been in town unexpectedly. Someone she hadn't seen in years. She'd lost track of time. The old friend's name was Derek Connolly. I knew that name. I knew it the way you know the name of a storm that came close to your house once, years ago, not close enough to do damage, but close enough that you never entirely forgot the direction it came from. Derek Connolly had been Melissa's boyfriend before we met. An armyman himself, now retired, living in Denver. They had stayed in loose contact over the years, the occasional birthday message, a comment on a social media post. I had never worried about it because I had never had reason to. How long were you with him? I asked. Ronald, it wasn't, how long? She pressed her lips together. I met him for lunch at 1. We talked, and then we walked around the waterfront, and time got away from me. My phone died. Your phone died, I repeated. Yes. The duty officer at the base said you signed out at 1400. That's 2 o'clock. Tyler gets out at 3. You had an hour, Melissa. An hour to charge your phone, or borrow one, or remember that your 8-year-old son was going to be standing outside a school waiting for you. She didn't answer. And instead you were walking around the waterfront, I said. With Derek Connolly. It wasn't what you're thinking. I looked at her for a long moment. 22 years of marriage gives you a particular fluency in reading another person. You learn the specific quality of their silences, the way their eyes move when they're holding something back, the slight shift in their posture that precedes a lie. I had learned Melissa's language over 2 decades, and what I was reading in her right now was not the language of someone who had simply lost track of time. Go to bed, I said quietly. We'll talk more tomorrow. She looked relieved, which was its own kind of answer. She left the kitchen. I sat with my cold coffee until 2 in the morning. The next morning, after Melissa left for the base and after I dropped Tyler at school, myself, personally, watching him walk through the front door before I drove away, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a sharp and precise woman named Dr. Carol Vining, who had been a friend of my mother's and who I trusted completely. The second was to my college roommate, Philip Dawes, who had spent 15 years as a private investigator before retiring and who owed me what he cheerfully called approximately 1,000 favors. I told Philip what I knew. He told me what he needed. I gave it to him. He said he'd be in touch. Then I went to work, because the bridge in Portland still needed its load calculations reviewed, and because I had learned from my father that the best thing a man can do when his world is restructuring itself is to keep his hands occupied with honest labor. Philip came back to me in 4 days. I met him at a coffee shop 2 miles from my office, a place with a corner booth where the ambient noise made privacy easy. He slid a folder across the table without ceremony. Philip had never been a man for ceremony. How long? I asked. Best I can determine from the digital trail, 7 months, he said. Maybe 8. The waterfront thing you already know about. Before that, 2 hotel stays, 1 in Seattle, 1 in Portland when she was there for a conference. Calls and messages going back to last November, the frequency picking up significantly around March. I opened the folder. I closed it again after the first photograph. There's more in there, Philip said. Financial stuff too. She's been transferring small amounts to a separate account. Nothing dramatic, but consistent. How much? Across 8 months, approximately $14,000. I nodded slowly. The number had a clarifying effect. It moved what I was dealing with from the category of emotional crisis into the category of concrete, documentable fact. That shift was useful. I had been an engineer for 25 years. I understood structures, and I understood the precise moment when a structure was no longer safe to inhabit. Thank you, I said. Ronald. He put his hand on the folder. I'm sorry. I know you are, I said. So am I. That evening, I did 3 things. First, I called Tyler's school and updated the emergency contact and pickup authorization list. My name, my sister Janet's name, my mother's name. Melissa's name was removed from authorized pickup entirely. I explained to Dr. Chambers, briefly and without drama, that there had been a change in our family situation. She understood. She said she would note it in the system immediately. She did not ask questions, for which I was grateful. Second, I called my sister Janet and told her the broad outline of what was happening. Janet is 4 years older than me and has always been, as our mother put it, a woman who absorbs information and deploys responses with military efficiency, which struck me, under the circumstances, as an irony worth noting. She was quiet while I talked. When I finished, she said, "What do you need?" Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "Have you considered?" Just, "What do you need?" That was Janet. "I need you to be available for Tyler if things get complicated," I said. "I'm already available," she said. "I was available before you called." Third, I went to the room in my house that served as a home office and I spent 2 hours organizing documents. Bank statements. Property records. The deed to our house. Tyler's school records. My own financial history, carefully maintained and clearly structured. The folder Philip had given me, cross-referenced with dates from Melissa's official travel records, which I had obtained through channels that were entirely legitimate and which I will not bore you with here. By the time I was done, I had a file that told a very clear story. I printed 2 copies and put them in separate secure locations. Then I poured myself 2 fingers of the good bourbon my brother-in-law had given me last Christmas and I sat in the dark in my living room and I let myself feel, briefly and completely, what it felt like to have 22 years dissolve into something like this. It felt like standing in a building you thought was solid and discovering that the foundation had been quietly, methodically hollowed out. It felt like the specific grief of realizing that the thing you had trusted most was the thing that had betrayed you most completely. It felt like anger, yes, the kind of anger that sits very still and burns very cold, nothing like the hot, chaotic rage of a younger man. It felt like the loss of a future I had assumed was guaranteed. It felt like, underneath all of it, a strange and terrible relief, because at least now I knew. At least the uncertainty was over. At least I was dealing with something real. I finished the bourbon. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months, which told me something about the weight I had been carrying without fully recognizing it. I did not confront Melissa that night. Or the next. I let her move through our house in the ordinary rhythms of her life, her morning runs, her base schedule, her evenings with her laptop and her second glass of wine, while I quietly completed the architecture of what came next. Dr. Carol Vining had already begun drafting paperwork. The family account, the joint account, had been assessed and notated. I had spoken to our bank about the secondary account Melissa had been quietly filling for 8 months. On a Thursday morning, 10 days after I had picked Tyler up from the school office, I called Melissa's cell phone from my car. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, what's up?" "I need you to come home this evening," I said. "By 6. I've made arrangements for Tyler to be at my mother's." A brief pause. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said. "It isn't. But it will be. Come home by 6. She was there at 5:45. I noticed she had changed out of her uniform into the jeans and blue blouse again, and I noted the choice without commenting on it. I had set the folder on the kitchen table. She saw it when she walked in. I watched her recognize it for what it was, or perhaps recognize that something had shifted irrevocably, because the careful social expression she had been wearing since she came through the door dropped away, and what replaced it was something rawer and more honest than anything I had seen from her in months. "Sit down, Melissa." She sat. I didn't raise my voice. There was no theater to it, no performance of fury. I had 30 seconds of heat behind my eyes that I let pass before I spoke, and then I talked to her the way I would have talked to a contractor who had failed a structural inspection, clearly, completely, without cruelty but without softness. I told her what I knew. I told her when it started, where it happened, how much money had moved from her joint account into hers. I watched the blood leave her face in stages as she understood the scope of what I was presenting. She tried, twice, to begin a sentence. I let her know, gently, that I wasn't finished. When I was finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "I'm not going to argue with you," I said. "I'm not going to yell. You made your choices, and I've had 10 days to understand them, and what I understand is this: our marriage is over. What happens next is going to be determined by how honest you are with me right now, and how cooperative you're willing to be for Tyler's sake. He's the only thing in this conversation that matters to me." She was crying by then. Not the dramatic kind, just a quiet, steady dissolution, the kind that comes when you understand that something is genuinely finished. She admitted everything. All of it. The 7 months, the hotel rooms, the money. She had been, she said, planning to leave. Not yet. But planning. Derek had been talking about a life together. She had been, in the language of people who make these calculations, keeping her options open. She tried to explain how she had felt unseen. How the demands of her career had created distance. How Derek had known her before the career, before the marriage, before everything, and there was something in that history that she had convinced herself was unfinished. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When she was done, I said, Tyler was alone in a school office for 3 hours and 15 minutes while you were walking around the waterfront with the men you were planning to leave us for. I want you to sit with that. She did. I could see her sitting with it. I've already contacted the school, I said. Your pickup authorization has been removed. Moving forward, Tyler's schedule, his school communications, his medical decisions, they go through me. Our attorney will be in touch with yours this week. I'd encourage you to retain someone good. She looked up at me. Ronald, I'm not angry with you, I said, and I meant it, in the way that it's possible to mean a thing that also contains grief. I'm sad. But this is done. The divorce proceedings began the following Monday. I had chosen Dr. Carol Vining specifically because she was, in the terminology of family law, formidable. She had reviewed Philip's documentation and described it as, and I quote, a very tidy package. The evidence of the affair, the financial transfers, the school incident documented in Dr. Chambers's own records, all of it composed a picture that was, as Carol put it, difficult to argue with. The first response from Melissa's attorney, a man named Theodore Braxton who had the look of someone accustomed to winning on charm, was a proposed agreement that divided our assets equally and proposed a 50-50 custody arrangement. Carol read it, set it aside, and said, they'll do better than this. They did better. But not before Melissa tried, twice, to reach me through channels that weren't our attorneys. The first attempt was a long text message at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, while Tyler was asleep down the hall and I was reading in the living room. The message covered familiar ground, regret, explanation, the suggestion that counseling might still be possible. I screenshotted and forwarded it to Carol, then put my phone face down and went back to my book. The second attempt was more significant. She showed up at my office. I have to give her credit for the strategy. Melissa had always understood pressure and how to apply it. My office was a professional setting. She arrived in her uniform. She sat across from me with the particular posture of a colonel accustomed to resolving difficult situations through the force of her own controlled authority, and she told me that she wanted to fight for the marriage, that she understood what she had done, and that she was prepared to do whatever was required. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, Melissa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. On the afternoon you left Tyler at school, when you were with Derek, were you thinking about Tyler? A long pause. I lost track of time, she said. That's not an answer to my question. She looked at the window. No, she said finally. I wasn't thinking about him. I know, I said. That's what I had to know. Please let the attorneys handle the rest. She left. She didn't come back to my office. What happened next happened across 3 months of careful, documented, professionally managed legal process, and I will give you the summary rather than the anatomy because the anatomy was grinding and painful and not particularly interesting to recount. Derek Connolly, it emerged, had a wife. Not ex-wife. Wife. A woman named Patricia who lived in Denver and who did not know, or had not known, that her husband had been renewing his relationship with a woman he'd dated before their marriage. Philip had found this detail in the course of his investigation and had noted it without comment, leaving what I did with it to my discretion. I spent 2 days deciding. I am not, by nature, a man who moves to cause suffering. I was not interested in destroying Melissa. I was not interested in Derek Connolly as an object of my anger. But Patricia Connolly was an innocent woman living inside a lie, and I had a particular, fresh understanding of what that felt like. I wrote her a letter. Not an anonymous one. I signed my name, included my phone number, and described what I knew in plain language with references to the documentation Philip had prepared. I told her I was sorry to be the one to tell her, and that I understood if she chose not to respond. I mailed it to the Denver address that appeared in the public records. She called me 8 days later. She had already known, she said. Not the specifics, but she had known something. She thanked me for the letter. She sounded the way I had felt that first night in the kitchen, not destroyed, but finished with something. I thought about that call for a long time afterward. The financial accounting took the most time. Our marital assets were substantial, 22 years of 2 professional incomes, a home that had appreciated significantly, retirement accounts, my firm's valuation. The $14,000 in Melissa's secondary account was addressed specifically and directly in the agreement. It was credited against her share of the marital assets, along with documentation of its origin. Theodore Braxton complained about this, as he was paid too. Carol was unmoved. The custody arrangement was where I fought hardest, and I want to be honest about that because it cost me something to fight it. Not legally, the case was strong. But I had not been raised to be the kind of man who uses a child as a weapon, and I was deeply conscious of the line between advocating for Tyler's stability and weaponizing Tyler's welfare. I spent a lot of time with that line. What I fought for was primary custody with me, generous visitation for Melissa, and a specific provision that neither parent could relocate Tyler more than 50 miles from his current school without a court modification. This provision was aimed, primarily, at the possibility, which Carol considered real, that Melissa might seek to follow Derek Connolly to Denver. We got it. Every piece of it. Tyler's therapist, a warm and unassuming man named Dr. Ellison, whom I'd started taking Tyler to see 6 weeks into the proceedings, not because Tyler was obviously in crisis but because I believed in not waiting for obvious crises, told me, 3 months in, that Tyler was doing well. Sad sometimes, confused sometimes, but well. Kids, Dr. Ellison said, need structure and honesty more than they need perfection, and what Tyler had was a father who had kept his schedule, kept his promises, and shown up consistently every single day. I thought about the volcano project. We had built it the weekend after I picked Tyler up from school. It had erupted magnificently across the kitchen table. I had taken photographs. Tyler's science teacher had given him extra credit. Small things. Reliable things. That was the work. The divorce was finalized on a Friday morning in October, 14 months after a phone call from a school secretary had rearranged my understanding of my own life. I sat in Carol's office afterward drinking terrible coffee from a paper cup while she walked me through the final documentation, and when she was done she looked at me and said, "You handled this with a lot of dignity, Ronald. That's not as common as it should be." I didn't feel particularly dignified. I felt tired, and sad, and underneath both of those things, the same quiet, cold relief that had settled over me the night in the kitchen. In the months that followed the finalization, I learned things about myself that I might not have learned otherwise. I learned that I was capable of cooking a genuinely decent meal, which had always been Melissa's domain and which I had always assumed required some talent I lacked. Tyler and I developed a Saturday morning ritual of making pancakes together, the kind of ordinary domestic moment that I had been adjacent to for years without fully inhabiting. I learned that I was better at being alone than I had expected, not happy about it, exactly, but functional in it, which was more than I had feared. I threw myself into the Portland Bridge project and 2 others, and my firm had its best fiscal year since we'd opened. Not because I was performing for anyone, but because work had always been, for me, a form of honest expression, and I was in a period of life where honesty felt more urgent than comfort. Philip told me, in the spring, that Derek Connolly and Patricia had formally separated. He told me this not because I had asked but because he considered it relevant to my picture of the situation. I absorbed the information without particular satisfaction. Whatever Derek Connolly's domestic circumstances were, they were not my story. I started running again. I had run in my 30s and stopped somewhere in my 40s when the knees began to register complaints. I started slowly, 3 mornings a week, before Tyler woke up. By spring I was running 5 miles on a good morning. My doctor, who had been expressing mild concern about my blood pressure for the past 2 years, removed the mild concern from my chart at my annual physical in March. Janet said, at Easter dinner, that I looked 10 years younger. I told her that was attributable entirely to the absence of carrying $14,000 in hidden bank transfers around in my bloodstream. She laughed, and then her eyes got careful, and she said, "Are you really okay, Ronald?" I told her the truth, which was, I was getting there. Tyler asked me, on a Sunday evening in April, why Mom and I had gotten divorced. I had been waiting for this question with the calm attention of a man who knows a structural test is coming and has prepared the load-bearing elements accordingly. I had discussed it with Dr. Ellison. I had thought about it by myself in the quiet of a dozen early mornings. I sat down with Tyler at the kitchen table, the same table where the volcano had erupted, where I had sat with cold coffee and a cold marriage in the weeks before everything changed, and I told him, in language appropriate to an 8-year-old who was nearly 9, that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and that what had happened was not his fault, and that both his mother and I loved him, and that some things, once broken, could not be put back together the same way, but could become something else, something different, something that still worked, if the people involved were willing to do the work. He thought about this for a while. Then he said, "Are we going to be okay?" "Yes," I said. "We're going to be okay." I meant it in a way I could verify with evidence, which is, for an engineer, the most satisfying kind of meaning. Melissa's visitation had settled into a workable rhythm. She had not, in the end, moved to Denver. Derek Connolly had moved back, briefly, and then moved on, to where and to whom I did not know and did not investigate. Melissa was still at the base, still a colonel, still decorated and celebrated and admired. She was, as far as I could observe through the neutral lens of co-parenting exchanges, a better mother in the contracted, scheduled reality of visitation than she had been in the diffuse, assumed reality of a marriage, perhaps because the stakes were clearer now, perhaps because she had lost enough to understand what she still had. I did not say this to anyone. I only observed it. She tried to speak to me, once, beyond the logistics of Tyler's schedule. It was at his school's spring concert, both of us sitting 4 seats apart in the 3rd row of the school auditorium while Tyler played what was technically a recorder solo of Hot Cross Buns with extraordinary seriousness of purpose. During the intermission, she appeared beside me and said, quietly, "I am sorry, Ronald. For all of it. I know you don't want to hear it, but I needed to say it." I looked at her for a moment. She looked tired and honest, which was a combination I had not seen in her in a long time. "I hear you," I said. Not that it was okay. Not that it didn't matter. Just that I heard her. And then Tyler's class came back out and we both turned to watch our son settle onto his chair with his recorder in his hands, and we were just 2 parents watching their kid play Hot Cross Buns, and that, in its small and ordinary way, was something. On a Thursday morning about 18 months after the divorce was finalized, I met a woman at a city planning meeting for the Portland Bridge project. Her name was Diane. She was a structural consultant who had been brought in by the city, and she disagreed with my load analysis in a way that was specific, detailed, and, upon examination, partially correct. I revised my calculations. I told her she'd been right about the secondary span. She said she usually was. We went for coffee after the meeting and talked for 2 hours about concrete and regulatory frameworks and, eventually, other things. I did not move fast. I had Tyler, and I had the understanding that comes from being hollowed out once, the knowledge that what you build next, you build more carefully. Diane was patient with the pace. She had her own history, her own daughter from a previous marriage, her own particular knowledge of what it felt like to reconstruct a life after the original plans had failed. What we built was not the same structure as what I'd had before. It was smaller in some ways, more deliberate in others. It had, I thought, better foundations, the kind you could see clearly because nothing was concealed in them. Tyler liked her. Not immediately, and not without the careful, watchful caution of a child who has learned that the people in his life can sometimes disappoint him. But over time, gradually, in the way that genuine things tend to develop, he liked her. He showed her the photographs of the volcano project. She was appropriately impressed. She asked if he wanted to build another one. He said yes, but bigger. She said she thought that sounded like an engineering problem worth solving. I heard him laugh. That laugh, easy and unguarded, was the clearest structural test I could have asked for. On a Saturday morning about 2 years after that Tuesday afternoon school call, I was making pancakes with Tyler, 9 years old now, nearly 10, with opinions about the correct ratio of blueberries to batter that he delivered with the gravity of genuine expertise, when he looked up at me across the kitchen counter and said, with the random, sudden directness that children deploy when you least expect it, "Dad, are you happy?" I stopped what I was doing. I looked at him. I thought about the bridge in Portland, which had opened on schedule and had received a commendation from the city. I thought about Diane, who was coming for dinner that evening. I thought about Janet's Easter table and 5-mile runs in the quiet of early mornings. I thought about 2 fingers of good bourbon in a dark living room, the specific grief of a foundation giving way, and the long, unglamorous work of building something better in its place. Yeah, I said. I really am. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to the blueberry ratio problem. I had last heard news of Melissa and Derek through a mutual acquaintance 6 months prior. Derek had quietly moved on to someone else, someone in his Denver circle, and Melissa was apparently aware of this and apparently processing it in whatever private way she processed things now. Whether that constituted justice, I could not say with certainty. What I could say was that the consequences of choices have a way of compounding over time, that the things we do in the hollow, private moments of our lives have a mathematics to them that is slow but not forgiving. I finished making the pancakes. Tyler set the table without being asked, which was a relatively new development and which I found, each time it happened, quietly remarkable. We sat down and ate together in the Saturday morning light, and the kitchen smelled like butter and blueberries, and outside the window the neighbor's dog was conducting its regular aggressive dispute with a squirrel, and my son was telling me about a book he was reading about the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge, which he considered, and I quote, actually really interesting for a bridge. I told him I was glad he thought so. I told him there was a lot more where that came from.